Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Linda Watkins. I'm Director of Marketing at Gatsby, and I'm excited to welcome you to our webinar today, Optimizing E-commerce with Gatsby. We have a couple of really exciting speakers joining us. And before we get started, just a couple of announcements. All the attendees will be on mute. So if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A chat window to ask your questions. And this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be available on our website a little bit later today. We'll also tweet out the recording link as well in case you missed any of the webinar. The Q&A window will be available throughout the webinar, so as you have questions, please submit them there. And we'll also have time dedicated at the end of the presentations for more questions. We are doing closed captioning for this webinar, and the link is in the chat window. So please go there if you would like to read the closed captioning during this live webinar. And with that, let me introduce our speakers. Whoops. One second. Sorry about that. I lost my presentation mode. There we go. Okay. All right, so first of all, I want to introduce Sam Bagwat. Sam is the co-founder and COO of Gatsby and a core contributor as well. And he also authored the Journey to the Content Mesh series, which is on Gatsby's blog, if you'd like to check that out. And that's about the changing nature of the website landscape. Brad Redding, co-founder of Elevar, is also joining us, and he's worked in e-commerce for about 14 years. He's managed over 100 e-commerce sites during his digital agency career, from direct-to-consumer startups to well-known brands like Le Creuset, Alex and Annie, Rebecca Minkoff, and Charbroil. He specializes in data analysis and conversion optimization. So we're also joined by Thomas Slade, who is VP of Engineering at Elevar, and he has been architecting e-commerce site builds for 9 years in a variety of hands-on and technical leadership roles. He has a passion for quality, innovation, and architectural efficiency. And he's worked on a variety of Magento Enterprise, Shopify, and custom e-commerce builds. So we're really lucky to have all our speakers here today. One more quick reminder that we have closed captioning. Here's the link, but also the link is in the chat window. So just go to the chat window and click on it there to get the closed captioning for this event. And also, if you want to follow us on Twitter, if you have comments about the webinar or questions, just go to Twitter and our handle is @GatsbyJS. You can find us there. Great, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter. Go ahead, Sam. I think I'm just passing you the controls right now.
Thanks, Linda. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to chat with everyone. Thanks for coming and thanks for taking the time out of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be. So I'm going to be talking today about Gatsby for e-commerce and creating a virtuous cycle for your team or agency. If you're a team that's building e-commerce sites within a company, or if you're an agency that is building e-commerce sites for clients. And we're going to talk about we're going to dive a little bit into how the client thinks about things from a business perspective to help you as a team or an agency establish yourself as a strategic partner to the business. So a kind of caveat here when we're talking about e-commerce. E-commerce is one category that this applies to. It also applies to lead generation sites. So a trend that we're seeing is Gatsby also being used for lead generation sites For B2C businesses in financial services, education, and healthcare. You might think of like a credit card sign-up form or an online course sign-up form, where the goal, similar to e-commerce, is to convert visitors into paying customers or leads for another service, but it's measured in terms of conversion. So to put it one way, if chaos is a ladder, then e-commerce is a tightrope. E-commerce is a tightrope because selling things on the internet is a really tricky business. There's constant competition really from everywhere in the world. And there's a very low barrier to entry, which means that anyone can come in and start competing against you, which means that a lot of your challenge is that your margins, your profit margins approach zero as your competition increases. And your constant challenge as a business, if you're an e-commerce business, is to continue making profit even in the face of a lot of competitors. And so, this is if you're an internal team or an agency partner of a business, like this is how you should think about your company or your partner. And to walk a little bit through like how this might work from a financial perspective, and this is a sort of example of a profit and loss statement that an e-commerce business might have. Or if it's a business that has many channels, for example, they might sell in retail and e-commerce, this might be their e-commerce, the profits and losses just for selling goods through e-commerce. So all businesses will sell a good for, we'll say here, $100. Then a lot of that will go to producing the good, manufacturing cost, labor cost, materials cost, all of that. And there'll be some online probably discounts that'll get applied. There'll be some G&A costs, which for those who some of folks may be familiar with, for folks that may be less familiar, this is just general overhead. So running the office, keeping the lights on, running payroll, having an HR department, all these things. And then there's costs that are specific to customer acquisition. So customer acquisition costs could be like Google AdWords spend on marketing, for example, paid acquisition. And at the end of the day, after the business pays all these costs, it's left with a little bit of profit. In this example, it's 10%. E-commerce businesses vary in what the profit is, but this is I would say, reasonably representative sample. And the challenge is that like a 10% margin business is a pretty low margin business, and it's always vulnerable to competition. And so you are here, if you're a team or an agency partner, you're sort of part of the customer acquisition cost. They need a website, obviously, to acquire customers, and they need you to build the website. Now, that's the tricky thing just in general is that websites are, again, a cost center of the business. There's something they're spending. And in general, like businesses try to reduce costs. So often businesses will be spending some amount of money on the website. They might want to know, well, how can we spend less money, for example, because they want to increase their profit because that's what they want to do as a business. And that's actually here where Gatsby can help you as an e-commerce agency or team, is that Gatsby is actually a tool for you to make yourself into a strategic partner by helping the business actually generate greater profit margins and turning yourself into a way that they can make more money rather than the business perhaps seeing the website team or the agency as a way that they're spending money. And the solution and the way that this works is margin expansion, which is just a fancy term of saying, a way of saying that for the same amount of revenue, making more money. So again, what does that mean? How does that work? Let's tie this. Gatsby has some unique properties as a technology that can help the business with this, and that as you build Gatsby properties and as you convert an e-commerce business's properties over to Gatsby, will help expand their margin. So here are some examples. So Gatsby improves performance, especially on mobile. Today, 50% of web traffic is on mobile, and a lot of visitors will bounce, especially on their phone, if the page takes 5 seconds, 10 seconds to load. Typically every extra 100 milliseconds adds 1% to the bounce rate. Second, Gatsby, so what this does is it increases the conversion rate. The number of visitors who end up getting through the whatever the flow is, to purchase a product will go up because fewer of them will have bounced along the way. In addition, Gatsby will get you more organic traffic because Google will reward organic search when you have a high-performing website. Now, this was a change they made recently to their magic formula, and for reasons that I think we all may understand, they want to reward sites that load quickly, and so you will get more organic traffic for this reason. At the end of the day, what this means for the business is that Gatsby will get them more money per visitor. Gatsby will get you more money per visitor. And so again, let's go back to our sort of example, e-commerce business profit and loss statement. So again, this is the same slide we saw before. $100 coming in from the sale of the good, and then $10 of profit at the end of the day. And actually, when you're able to sell more goods, all the relative costs go down. And so in this example, we see that the profit's going up to $16 for that $100 purchase price, and so margins going up from 10% to 16%. I'll walk through how that works. The assumptions, and every model has assumptions. The assumptions here are gaining 10% more traffic from SEO. This is actually a fairly conservative assumption. And then increasing conversion rate 10%, which can also be a conservative assumption depending on your current site speed. And so generating 20% more sales. Again, as I mentioned, the margins will increase from 10% to 60%. And what that means for the business is that they'll get 60% more profit, right? Because previously 10%, now 16%, that's 60% more profit. So walking again through how this math works, there's sort of 3 factors that this will drive. First, it's often the case that when businesses sell more goods, it's cheaper to produce each good. There are economies of scale in production. There's a little bit of so our model is that this happens a little bit. The good previously cost $60 to produce, now it costs $59 because we're producing more of them. Our general overhead costs go down proportionally. So if we make 20% more sales with the same number of sort of headcount in headquarters, admin staff and such, then we're decreasing the relative cost 20%. So from $10 on the good to $8. The same thing with customer acquisition costs and marketing spend in general. Because we're selling 20% more goods, that means our cost is relatively reducing 20%. So from $15 to $12. Each of these contributes to the margin expansion. And there's a total margin expansion of 6% from 10% to 16%. So this is what this does is it turns as the sort of executive team, the CMO in an e-commerce shop, or the GM of that particular division sees this happening, what this does is it changes the perception of your team or your agency from a cost center to a profit center. You're actually a strategic tool of the businesses to increase their profit margins. And when you're doing projects, there's lots of questions to ask, like to get a sense of, well, because you might be asking now, okay, so this is a great sort of toy example. How would I understand for my business or my client's business what those numbers would be? Well, you can ask them questions. You can ask them what their profit margins are. You can ask them what their customer acquisition costs are. You can ask them you can ask them these kinds of questions, and then you can model. You can ask them and try to estimate the gains to performance based on how fast Gatsby sites typically load versus how fast their existing sites typically load. And then you can come forward and say, look, I think if we move our sites over to Gatsby, we'll actually see these business impacts, which this kind of narrative as you as a team or an agency are working with e-commerce partners, it turns you into a strategic partner, which is a great place to be. And we start off this by saying it's a virtuous cycle. It'll get you more business, and like you may, for whatever reason that you may want to be building in Gatsby rather than other things. Maybe like Gatsby is a lot of fun to build in, and maybe you and your team prefer building in Gatsby. And this is by showing the business benefits to the strategic to your client or your executive team. You become a strategic partner and are able to build the Gatsby sites that you want to build. And generate more website work for your team or agency as they see you as key to driving up margins in the business. So that's all. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Sam. Now, before we move on with the next presenters, we have a quick poll for you. So we'd love to know, what e-commerce platform do you use? So I guess if you use more than one, just choose the one that you use the most or today. And if the e-commerce platform you use isn't listed here, feel free to put it in the chat window. So we'd love to know, are you using BigCommerce or Salesforce, Shopify, Magento, or WooCommerce? So go ahead and, great, I see people putting in their votes now. Again, if your platform of choice isn't listed here, you can add it to the chat window. And great, we're at about 50% voted. We'll get up to maybe 70% in just a minute, and then I'll close the poll and I'll share the results with you. Great, just a couple more seconds. All right, so I'm going to close the poll now, and let's look at the results. Okay, so majority using Shopify, and then Magento, WooCommerce, kind of a distant second, and then Salesforce and BigCommerce coming in at the end. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. And we'll have another one a little bit later in the presentation as well. And with that, I'm going to change the presenter over to Brad and Thomas.
Great, thanks, Linda. I'll wait till we get our slides up here. Awesome. Nice to have everyone on here. As Linda mentioned, my name is Brad. I've been in e-commerce personally for far too long, it seems, but 13 years, where Thomas and I and others, we've been through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears when it comes to migrations and rebuilds and redesigns. And this particular case study that we'll be going through today, I think is really an amazing one, as we've been seeing the landscape of e-commerce change and platform change. And obviously we have a big Shopify contingency here, and Shopify has really been leading that. Historically, I've been on Magento for many years, and most recently spending most of my time on Shopify. So quick background on Elevar. So we build software and solutions for e-commerce businesses. We're a bit of a hybrid where we focus primarily on data analysis and on-site performance optimization, and you'll see some of that come to fruition through my presentation, and ultimately when I hand off to Thomas, where he'll go through the nuts and bolts of how we went through and built the Gatsby site, and ultimately how we're achieving such amazing site speed with this Trivetkin site. The site that we'll be going through today is Trivetkin. As you can see, Trivetkin, if you're not aware, they're a global brand. They're a skincare brand. They are both a direct-to-consumer site, which is what we built, and you can also actually find them in worldwide through thousands of retail store locations like Ulta, Sephora, etc. I'll be going through 3 parts today before I hand it off to Thomas, who'll get more into the nuts and bolts of the technical side. So the 3 parts I'll be going through is going through the challenge that we faced. I'll secondly be going through the approach, so the approach that we took leading into the project and ultimately through launch. And then I'll be going through marketing and how we approach the marketing aspect of the build, because you can build a site and have it can be the best site in the world, fastest site in the world, but if we make a few mistakes on the marketing side, then that can really cause what we think and we're celebrating as a great site not end up being the case, because we're chasing our tails, and whether it's organic SEO or third-party marketing, tagging, etc. The challenge. So the challenge that we faced going into the project, Trivetkin was on a 10-plus-year-old platform on Magento 1 Enterprise. The platform, the backend itself was over 10 years old. There were 4 to 5 different themes that have been built on top of one another over the years. And for us, the biggest challenge came in was decoupling the features and third parties and various interconnections that were happening. So as if you've experienced that before, I'm sure you can relate. When we're going through the discovery process, it can be difficult for someone to remember every single feature, every third party, or every dependency that they ultimately are going to need for the new site. So that was a pretty significant challenge that we were facing. Along with that, the challenge that we were seeing and living in the Magento and other, and this isn't necessarily just Magento, but when companies are used to, and we have clients that are used to that aren't technical, they're not technical in nature, they weren't skilled, they're not skilled in HTML or CSS, and if they're being forced to actually update content, update banners, imagery, etc., and they're having to do HTML and CSS, and historically, before we've seen ecom rapidly change over the last 3 to 5 years, clicking that save button or that clear cache button, that can be scary because that can take the site down, because when you clear cache, it ends up a problem that hasn't surfaced yet that comes to fruition, and all of a sudden checkout's broken or there's a very funky UX error. So moving the direction of a new innovative solution where we're looking at Shopify plus Gatsby plus Prismic, there's some education and just helping the client feel more comfortable about the change, where our ultimate goal is to remove that stress and that fear of you can make updates to your site without having to live in fear of bringing down the site or breaking something or impacting the user experience. The second challenge that we faced was merchandising. So Strivecken is a very active brand. Their content and commerce initiatives are great. They are constantly rolling out new products, new promos, new initiatives, and giving them the freedom to build their own experience, so not just having to live in a quote unquote category page or a collection page UX, but giving them the ability to create custom landing pages on the fly where they can quickly pull in product grids or potentially blog posts or really anything about any custom content that you might be able to pull in. We're seeing that come to fruition a little bit with the Shoguns and Zipifys of the world of having landing page builders. But again, the merchandising for us and moving them down this experience, this was a big challenge for us to really hit early in how we're going to architect the build to make it easy for the client, where anybody can jump in. They don't need to know HTML or CSS. The third challenge, so this is, I think, one that everyone is facing. The world's moving mobile. I don't need to go through and repeat the same stats that we've probably all heard with Amazon, where increased conversion rate or decreased site speed by X will increase conversion rate by Y. I think for us, we look at it more in just the qualitative side of all of us, most of us, or 88% of us on a daily basis are using Facebook, are using Instagram or Pinterest or Snapchat or any of the others out there. So we're being trained to get used to a very fast experience. So when we are navigating on our phone through Facebook or Instagram, the experience is fast, it's instantaneous, there's no loading, there's no waiting. We don't need to wait to view another post or view another image. And that behavior, so we feel that behavior is being trained in us. So when we are prospecting, so our Strivecken or if you're prospecting on different channels, we want to make that transition into your site as seamless as possible. So it's not the customer is used to navigating through Facebook and it's very fast, and all of a sudden they go to your site and they're having to wait 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds for different pages to load. You'll see that with high bounce rates. So if you look at Facebook prospecting campaigns to a specific landing page, and if you see a 90% bounce rate, that could be due to site speed. So really for us, it was honing in on how can we look at the growth goals for our customers, is how can we enable that process of building the best prospecting experience as possible on mobile, as we're seeing 80 to 90% of prospecting campaigns on Facebook, they're coming from mobile. So that was a big challenge for the project for us to make sure that we got right. And obviously that ties into site speed. So the fourth challenge that we had with the project is for Strivecken, and again, our experience with Magento for many years is you'd have different apps and extensions that are added on years over year, and that causes site speed performance issues. It causes outages or delays during Black Friday or different big promo periods, and that can be very frustrating, not only for the brand, but it can also be frustrating for the consumer and the customers, and not wanting to go back if they had a poor experience. So we wanted to be sure that we got site speed right, especially going into the holiday season, and really ensure that we're treating their loyal customers and giving them the best experience as possible. So those challenges rolled into what approach we were going to take. So the approach that we took, which is I think a bit unique. So Thomas, and he'll go in a little bit more shortly. So we actually built a prototype using Magento 1. He built a Gatsby, a headless Magento 1 build using Gatsby. It was very bare bones, but we just wanted to demonstrate this is what's possible in the new world of ecom. This is your product data, this is your site, and it's living on top of Gatsby is basically making the experience really, it's changing it overnight from what if you were to pull up your live site and looking at the prototype. So we wanted to show them what is possible in terms of site speed with the catalog. And then we're able to move into some ROI benchmarking of looking at some of the KPIs like revenue per visitor change or mobile conversion rate change or repeat purchasers change. Obviously the big KPI for any business is revenue, and what we're looking at are what are some of the KPIs underneath that big bucket of revenue. What can we really have the most control over? And these three were big ones. And the repeat purchaser, this goes back to what Sam was speaking about with CPA or cost per acquisition, is we want to make that first experience for a new customer, for a prospecting campaign. If we can get them through once, then and they had a great experience, and they've been able to compare. It's an innovative site. It's a lot faster than maybe competitors. The likelihood of them coming back, we feel, is going to be much greater than if they had a poor or slower or janky experience in that first time. So this is more of I would say a long tail KPI that we're looking at for the project. And then finally, the second approach is looking at the data-driven UX or design. So most companies are doing this. You're taking data from Google Analytics or Hotjar, A/B tests, or in our case, our own product Elevar, and using that to help drive some initial data-driven UX decisions or ideas. But I would say the most important thing and thing that I'm proud of our team for doing is our engineering team. Thomas, he was leading the design conversations, because going with the Prismic and the Gatsby build or this headless CMS build, you don't have to live in the box that we're all used to. So as designers or marketers, we may think like, oh, we can't design this because we have to live in this box. But with the engineering team having the freedom and flexibility to really build anything, the ideas that they're going to come up with and what they did come up with are things that I would never think of, and our design team wouldn't think of. So having them involved in that process, I think, was key for us, because they're going to be able to stretch their imagination, piece together the architecture during design or before even design's handed off. And that I think has really led to a great experience and a great end product. So the marketing side, so we went through a challenge, went through the approach that we took for the challenge, and then the marketing before I hand it off to Thomas. So again, as any site launch, if you don't get marketing right, then it's going to be an uphill battle. It could be the fastest site ever, but you might be chasing your tail because something didn't go right on the marketing side. So a couple points to make here on the marketing dependencies and how we handled it. So we planned early in the project. So this is a Shopify Plus Gatsby Prismic build. So it's not a normal project where a third party can just install an app and then their JavaScript is implemented and it's there and available for use. So it was educating those third parties very, very early in the process. The second thing is moving as much as we can to Google Tag Manager. So we built a very robust data layer, and we have the route changes, their Gatsby route changes to control different page views, but really shifting all of that third-party tracking to Google Tag Manager for a few reasons. One, because we're able to control more of the event-based tracking, which even Google Analytics is going to with a new event, their new event property-based tracking. But also we're able to then time events. So the Zendesk live chat, which I mentioned in one of my articles, that doesn't necessarily need to load at first all page load. That can load 2 to 3 seconds after the page is ultimately loaded for the user. So we wanted to actually move this to GTM, control the order of the tagging to ultimately help our site speed performance scores. At every single third party that the Thomas and team implemented, we were doing it before and after. Okay, here is a Lighthouse score speed before, here is it after. Things that we can do to either move the integration to be an API-based integration with a third party, or can we start moving that timing back for the tag that fires in GTM, so then we can try to get rewarded a little bit from Google with that score. Then the last thing is in the marketing side is the on-site SEO and launch planning. Again, this is a very new site for us and everyone of that headless build. We've seen with other clients that are on headless builds, we've seen the organic lift after they launched, but to really it's planning out that on-site SEO, so all the technical SEO, the structured data, not just the 301 directs, but planning all of that in advance, so we have that in place before we get to that 30-day pre-launch period. So we're not chasing our tail again, either pre-launch or post-launch, and having to scramble and make sure that we have the proper structured data, the proper metadata, open graph tags, et cetera. So that's a challenge approach, and the marketing aspect of the build. I think I'll hand it off to Thomas. It'll go through more in the stack and how we built it. Thomas, take it away.
Thank you, Brad, and thanks everyone for joining today. I kind of wanted to start a little bit by giving you some background on me and kind of the headspace that I've been in for, I don't know, 8 years or so. But come from a agency that builds a lot of Magento sites, so I'm used to being in an environment where you're thinking about how to cache, you're thinking about servers, you're getting called late at night, the site's slow, it seems like an uphill battle anytime you want to change anything. The front end's completely coupled with the back end. So I kind of am used to living in an environment like that. And for the past couple of years, I've just been thinking more and more like, how can we make e-commerce a static activity? And so that kind of leads into the dream of this project, where we basically wanted to take transactional user actions and static user actions and try to separate those apart, just because typically people think that you need a server to facilitate any action on an e-commerce site, but it doesn't really need to happen that way. And I think we've proved it with this project. Another thing too is just getting rid of the servers. We're tired of having managed hosting or managing it ourselves and just having to keep up with security and not being able to deploy code in a distributed way. Everything would have to be architected that way to be able to be sent out that way. So I wanted to go through some of the examples of kind of static ecom user actions. So I think browsing the catalog is the really obvious one. Users don't need to go to a server to see products. Another example that I think is pretty static is adding to cart. If there's really complex if there's really complex pricing logic or anything like that, that can actually be static. We can put that as part of the client if we need to. Another thing is adding to wish lists. Like why do we need servers and controllers and everything else to handle these different things? Another one that we were able to do is search. Most people would think no way you can ever do search as a static kind of thing, but we were able to. And filtering products is another one too. So, layered navigation where someone's filtering by size or color, or something like that. If you could make that static, then we're talking a pretty near native experience for the end user. And I want to go through some of the transactional user actions and kind of how I think about those. So logging into an account. So if a user needs to look at their order status, we need a server, we need something that can basically send back that user's details, something that's secure. Another one is purchasing a product. Obviously, we can't do that all in the client, and there might be discount codes and things like that. So, coupon code. Another one would be signing up for a newsletter. So if someone comes to the site and they want to sign up for your newsletter, we need somewhere to capture that data, store it. So that's kind of the headspace that I was in going into this project. And now I'm going to kind of dive into a little bit of the goals that we had, the technical goals for the project. The first, obviously, Brad's already talked about this one, but speed and performance. That's a huge one. Another one that kind of goes overlooked most of the time, sometimes not necessarily by the engineering team, but just as a problem that happens from a platform that's really old, is developer experience. I mean, the amount of time that it takes a developer to get ramped up on a project and contributing, if you can shorten that, it makes everything much cheaper, much like Sam was talking about earlier. We wanted the ability to have, all the niceties of a modern developer experience, so hot reloading. We wanted data access to be really easy and the ability for any developer to get up and running really quick. Along with developer experience comes type safety. So we wanted to use TypeScript just so that we could do error checking during our deployments and builds as part of our CI/CD. We also wanted to have static payloads. That kind of goes back to getting rid of the servers, and data layer access. So, I don't want to think about complex queries. I don't want to think about left joins. I want people to be able to get the data they need and put it in the components, and make that process as seamless as possible. And then another aspect too is making sure the content model for the client is intuitive. So coming from Magento, you have these kind of like static blocks, and they can reference other blocks, and after 5 years, the site just becomes spaghetti, and no one knows why, how, and they get scared to delete anything, so it just becomes kind of a nightmare. So we wanted to make it so that things were really intuitive for the client. So after coming up with these technical goals, we came up with kind of like an idealized stack that we wanted to use. And this was after I had done the prototype that Brad mentioned before. So all of our products are hosted on Google Cloud, so we wanted to use Google Cloud. We wanted to use Gatsby to basically generate that payload for us. And we wanted to use Storybook, so the developer would just be interacting with Gatsby and Storybook, and have Prismic basically a source for Gatsby to be able to get the content that's needed. And the last aspect here is having Shopify. So checkout and account management, if we're thinking back to kind of static versus transactional, we basically wanted to offload everything we could to Shopify where possible. So I'm gonna go into each one of these and kind of give the reasons why we did idealize this stack. So the first, Gatsby, the developer experience is amazing, and the speed is awesome. So you get server-side rendering at build time. You get React hydration, so that's a very familiar place for most front-end developers to be. You get image optimization, the WebP support. You get the lazy loading, the content mesh. I think the content mesh, if you haven't read Sam's article on the content mesh, it's pretty mind-blowing once you get in there and see the power in that, just having consistency for how things can be queried. It's very, very powerful. Also link preloading, so that's kind of that near native speed gain as well, where things are loaded in the background and a user doesn't have to load the header 500 times if they go to 500 pages, just trying to basically minimize the amount that the user needs to get. And also Gatsby's plugin ecosystem, it's pretty popular. It's got a lot of good plugins and a lot of source and transformer plugins as well. And just the community, I mean, going on to GitHub and seeing the amount of contributions and just how big the community is with Gatsby, it's pretty amazing just to see how far that they've come. And so Shopify is the next piece of the puzzle. So they have a storefront API that allows for querying and mutating where needed, so that you can basically perform all the transactions that need to be done for the site. They also have a pretty vast plugin ecosystem, and it's not all of them would work for our use case, and we kind of went into it knowing that, just because a lot of them are theme-based plugins, but there's still a lot that just interact with the backend that a client and an e-com manager would look at and really want to have for their site. And the last part, security again. So just being able to offload that and not have to worry about it, and to be able to sleep comfortable at night. So one of the next parts is Storybook. So Storybook's basically a UI framework for displaying UI components. It allows, it's designer friendly. It allows you to see components in various states. And it also allows for you to approach your project plan a lot differently than a typical project. So you can actually componentize your project plan. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in the next few slides, but it's a pretty powerful idea. And it also decouples your component data from your fetching, which I think is very nice, so that your developers aren't worried about basically where the data comes from. They're not worried about how to power a component while they're designing it. So having your mind share dedicated to a component and the state is really nice, and not having to consider how does this data get from point A to point B. If you can separate yourself from that, it allows you to develop in a lot cleaner manner. And then also they have add-ons. So there's a lot of things like viewports and knobs and things like that make Storybook a really powerful way to show different components and how you can interact with them. And then kind of one of the final parts is Prismic. So Prismic is basically a headless API content management system, and they have a pretty intuitive content modeling. So it's just basically like an admin. You just kind of log in, and you can define blocks, and you can reuse them, and basically they're exposed via an API, and there's a source plugin for it, so you can query them in Gatsby. They also have releases, they have webhooks, so they have all the things that developers want to have. And they also have a beta integration with Shopify, so that your catalog basically shows in the admin of Prismic, so that you can associate things to products, which is pretty nice. And then with Google Cloud, no matter what, there might be a situation where you need to have basically an endpoint or something for, maybe you have a secret key and you can't put that in the client, so you need a place to be able to hide that. Well, that's kind of pushed us towards Firebase. So Firebase hosting, basically, it's pretty simple, but they have functions, basically cloud functions that integrate with them, so you can have your site calling endpoints that map to functions, so that all your backend processes can basically live in functions, and you don't have to worry about managing a server. You don't have to worry about scaling. It's a pretty simple way to handle things. They also have cloud build, so it's similar to Circle CI, but it has an integration with GitHub as well. But I'll show a little bit more of that once we get into the how we deployed. And so now I'm going to get into the project plan. So I think this goes back to the storybook slide, where a lot of today's talk is focused on approaching projects a little bit differently than page by page. So you can see from the different stages below that, we started with design, and then we went into storybook, and storybook probably took the most of the project. It's probably 50% of the project, just because we're just basically creating components, creating state. We're making the whole website, but we're doing it in a way where we can separate data from that process. Then we move into Prismic, and then Gatsby, and then the integrations and deployment. So for Storybook, I'm going to get a little bit into how we approach the project plan and kind of broke things down in Storybook. So what we would do is we'd start out with the design. So here's an example of the actual design and what actually became components. So you can see on the left the mock-up, and we basically, me and shout out to Joe Alden, so him and I would go through and take the designs and basically break them down meticulously and go through mobile and desktop, and we would break them down and come up with little reusable pieces that we could from a design. And then, so in this example, you can see the last component down here, the before and after. We would take that and actually start breaking it down and saying, okay, well, what kind of props are driving this component? What kind of state's driving this component? And we would come up with ways to come up with props and type every component before we had any data coming from an external system. So you can see here the props that are that I've outlined for each one of the component pieces. So that kind of leads into the storybook aspect of it. So you can see on the top left, there's the before and after props, which is just an array of slides, and then the actual before and after slide. You can see that, again, it has that label, the title, the text, the disclaimer that are optional, and then we kind of have our component definition below. And then the code on the right is basically what it looks like in Storybook. So the slides function is just to show that, in Storybook, we're just generating a bunch of mock data, and then we actually use that as the prop for the before and after slide, as you can see when the story's actually added. And below, you can see what that looks like in Storybook. So you can see that the components there, and also that there's the knobs feature with that shows basically the different props that are driving that. So let me get into where that comes from, and that is basically via the add-ons with Storybook. So we used a bunch of different add-ons, but the ones I'm going to touch on are basically viewports and knobs. And we also had actions as well. I feel like knobs and actions kind of go hand in hand, but I will show examples of how those work. So viewports is the first one. It allows you to view your components in different viewports, so that the client, we don't have to think about emulating a device or anything like that. And again, it doesn't do like full emulation, but it at least just shows things in different breakpoints for us and makes it a little bit easier to navigate components. The next one is the knobs and actions, and as you can see below, I'm changing text at the bottom here, and you can see the text changes above are represented. And basically, it allows them to just toggle state, toggle data. So if the client wanted to come in here and go, is this going to overflow if I add too much text? things like that, they can use those knobs to kind of toggle different things there. So that moves on to the next stage, which was basically the content modeling in Prismic. And I was kind of explaining a little bit before, but Prismic is like an admin for defining what they call types, and it allows you to basically just make up fields, and they can be rich text, they can be images, and you can just basically drag and drop them to make however you want to model your content. And it also has the integration with Shopify as well. So here's an example of the product type. You can see it's just fields. There's nothing filled out because this is just a type. And so you might be asking yourself, well, how did you go about defining your types? Because you already went through the storybook process, and you've already kind of done most of the work there, and that's exactly the point. That's why we separated our data from the implementation, just because we were able to take, on our left here, you can see the ingredient type, ingredient props, and you can see how we essentially map those directly into Prismic and can define each one of them here. So I think that's the point of going through this exercise, is that if you can separate your data from your components and develop them in isolation, it makes the integration with whatever CMS you want to use, if it's Prismic, Contentful, WordPress, whatever it is, whatever that external system is, it makes it very simple to basically define what you need. So stage 4 was Gatsby, and with Gatsby, probably the most complex thing about our project is the build time. So there's things you have to consider here, like the content mesh, routing. There's validation as well. Prismic doesn't offer validation out of the box, so that can be pretty troublesome. So here's an example of our content mesh. As you can see, this is like the home page, and the carousel at the top is coming from Prismic. Another source plugin we have is Yotpo, which is basically a review system. So their API is feeding in the reviews that you can see with the stars. And then Shopify is actually mapped to the products that are displaying on the site. So with routing, things that need to be considered, like what documents in Prismic need to actually have pages. So if you have a product, that obviously needs a page because somebody needs to be able to view a product, but maybe the footer doesn't need a page, right? Just because it's just a design element that's there, but it doesn't necessarily need a route. So with validation, I mentioned before that Prismic doesn't have validation, but there's also, there's other things that you need to consider that might not be too obvious, but like what if your product in Prismic doesn't have an associated Shopify product? There's situations like that where a client could potentially publish something, so developers just need to kind of consider those things and build in some fail-safe ways to handle them. So those are kind of the things that we had to think about for the build time, and that kind of takes us to runtime. So runtime, I think, was in our favor because the client's catalog was relatively small, probably 200 products. So it did make things a lot simpler from that standpoint. But there's other things we had to consider if we're thinking back again to static versus dynamic. We had sessions, so we need to be able to manage cart state, wish list, if the person's logged in or not, what products have they recently viewed, and then obviously that's those sessions are going through global context, and just wrapping all the components that are via like a layout file in Gatsby, and then the other thing is just wiring the components with real data. So a lot of it is just use static query, which is a nice hook that Gatsby offers so that you can query things in components relatively easily. So if I break down the sessions in global context a little bit, the layout, like I mentioned, contains a lot of context. So we have context for like the wish list, we have context for the cart, and a lot of those contexts that are user specific are synced via local storage. And just to let you know too, for this project, we used React 16.8. We might actually be on a higher version now because we kept our dependencies up to date using Renovate Bot, but we didn't use Redux or anything like that. We just used the reducer hook that React provides. And I mentioned before that the client's catalog is relatively small. So this allowed us to really do something that is probably not conventional and not appropriate for every client, but for us it was. It's just that our client, since they only had such a small catalog, we were able to store the products in global context. So basically on any page, anytime we needed like basic product details, we could use that. This allowed for us to render products in a list or grid without having to think about querying, which is really, really nice. And it also just made our searching and filtering like much simpler, because we kind of had the details of every single product that we needed. And kind of here's an example of what those details look like. You can see there's not much data here. It's mostly basic data. And I wanted to show everyone kind of like a component example. So this is generally what most of our components look like. It starts with data fetching, as you can see to the right. There's our footer query. Obviously, this is all reduced just to show it in one slide. And then we kind of have our translation layer, and then we have our component with data. So these components are really just like wrappers for your real components. It's just the difference between the components in Storybook and these components is that Storybook's giving them mock data, we're giving them real data and translating them. So then that leads into the integration with Shopify. So a lot of people are probably wondering, well, how do you integrate with Shopify? And basically, like I was saying before, we just wanted to offload all the transactional aspects to Shopify. So checkout was done via the API. Logging in and out and account management, we're actually using the storefront. So a user is actually going off-site to actually log in and do things like that. So here's an example of like a checkout mutation with Shopify. So when someone wants to check out, we essentially send this mutation over, and then what comes back is a URL that's like a unique checkout URL for that user, and then the user's redirected there to finish the checkout. And then for account management, again, like I mentioned, it's a subdomain of our current store, and we just redirect users. Just go to Shopify when they want to log in, view account information, and look at their orders, things like that. And the only downside to this is it requires some theming, and also it allows you to not be able to use some third parties, but we had specific requirements where third parties were managing account pages. So this forced us kind of into this approach. So that's kind of it from the development side of things. And I wanted to give you a glimpse into the deployments that we did for the environment as well. So to our right, you can see GitHub. Basically, there's some conveniences there. So we have environments per pull request. We have environments per merge. And I would mention earlier Renovate Bot, but every time Renovate Bot runs a dependency update, we automatically get those as separate environments as well. And all of those go through Google Cloud Functions. And those functions serve two purposes. Some of them are functions for things like for instance, our client sells recurring products. So there's an API call that needs to happen, and there's secrets that need to happen, secrets that need to be secret. So what we've done there is basically split the checkout, and we manage that secret in a function, and the user hits it like an HTTP endpoint, and then they're redirected from there. But the functions also serve purposes like running Lighthouse for us every day, or triggering builds when GitHub notifies the function that it wants to build. We also have webhooks you can see to the left that are coming from Shopify and Prismic when updates are happening. And then Cloud Build down is what the functions are firing, and those essentially trigger Gatsby builds, which come out with website payloads. Those payloads are then synced to Firebase, which is our hosting, and that's kind of it. It looks a little intimidating, I feel like, from this diagram, but it's not too bad. And so anyways, we launched the site, and Felicity, the CDO at Strive, she had to say this about the launch. I mean, it was very, very smooth. It felt really nice to come from the Magento world and just see how simple it is. And so just some results on the site, it's really, really fast. We deploy like 20 or 30 times a day, so we always have deployments going on. Our builds, if they fail from like type checking or something like that, they never get deployed. So we have some nice checks that happen that prevent bad code from getting shipped. And again, launch was simple, and you know, some marketing things as well as that our organic search. I know Sam mentioned it in his, but our organic search went up 30%. And yeah, we're just monitoring the conversion rate and gonna see where that takes us. And I know Linda wanted me to share as well, like a side-by-side. So this is like a side-by-side of their Magento site with Gatsby's on the left, Magento's on the right, just so you can see, like, you can see the server, like probably burning through RAM trying to get a page to basically load. You know, they were paying around $2,000 per month. I mean, I know their database server was like 128 gigs of RAM. It's just crazy to think the amount of energy getting wasted when it doesn't need to be. But anyways, on the left you can see Gatsby. It's snappy and really fast. So just wanted to show that, and I think Linda can take back over and we can get to Q&A.
Great. Thanks both Brad and Thomas. Really appreciate that. And as a quick reminder, if you haven't started building a Gatsby site yet, you can get started at gatsbyjs.com. Or if you already have a Gatsby site and you want to use Gatsby Preview, which is a way to see real-time updates to your site before it goes live, you can also get started on gatsbyjs.com. So we've had a couple questions come through, and we have time for just a few. And so go ahead and keep submitting your questions there. But a couple questions were around Shopify and any challenges that you faced using Shopify.
Thomas, I can jump in from the marketing side. I honestly, I don't really think there were too many challenges that we encountered from the transition. Product management was pretty straightforward. We're able to mirror products in Prismic. Checkout API in terms of the QA and testing process worked great. We have recharge. We're using the recharge checkout API as well, as Thomas mentioned, for the recurring payments. So from the marketing side, no major red flags came up other than the occasional third party that would have their global JavaScript that they want to implement that we would either route them towards an API-based integration or through Google Tag Manager. Thomas, I don't know if there are any other technical challenges that you faced.
Yeah, I mean, it really just, it kind of goes project by project, but Shopify's apps use a proxy through their theme. So it really does kind of limit you if you're not using their theme. But for us, we knew that. We knew how the apps worked. So we went into it expecting those challenges, and we worked around them when we could.
Okay, great. Do you run any A/B testing?
Yes, right now we currently are not, but we have dynamic yield, which is the tool that we'll be using for personalization and A/B testing. But generally, post launch, we like to wait at least 30 days, just for any site, but wait 30 days just to let everything settle in and then start implementing test ideas there. So yes, we don't have any running now, but we will be probably within the next 30 days.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then how long are your build times, or how many pages are statically generated?
I want to say around 300. Our build times are around 7 to 9 minutes.
Okay, great. And then what was the timeline for the project?
We kicked off design roughly about March 1st, and design took about two and a half months. We were getting started a little bit in the background on the Shopify and data migration side, and we launched on July 24th.
Okay, great. A few more questions on Shopify, and then we'll probably need to wrap it up. One is around, is the client able to edit Shopify sections?
No,
Yeah,
I was just going to say our Prismic is driving the content, purely driving the content. There's no content coming from Shopify. Shopify is only there to control inventory, pricing, and the transactional things that I touched on.
Okay, great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So just another big thank you to Sam, Brad, and Thomas for joining us today. Like I mentioned before, the recording of the webinar will be up on our website at gatsbyjs.com a little bit later today. So if you missed any of this webinar, you can catch it there. And again, thank you so much for all the speakers for joining us.